Attention! We need a revolution.
Yes, we do, James. It's almost a year since I wrote about attention scarcity, the piece that started this whole podcast off. So let's talk about what's changed in those 12 months and why I think we need change now.
All to come on this podcast, all about the attention economy from the attention practice and phonogram. Welcome to Can We Have Your Attention? Claire, I can't believe it's been almost a year.
Neither can I, not just because the passage of time scares me with aging.
Well, yes. Yes. That scares all of us.
It scares all of us. I can't believe it's been a year, and yet I can.
Yes, I know. It is, and it's been quite a year for lots of reasons. But just tell me a bit about, before we go into what we're going to talk about today, about the reaction initially to that piece, other than this idiot that you knew from university going, do you fancy doing a podcast off the back of it? What other kind of reaction did you get?
So when I was writing it, I remember thinking, this feels like a synthesis of everything I'd been feeling and experiencing and seeing in my own work for such a long time. And I think I initially thought that I would get responses from people who work in the advertising sector, because that was really where I was noticing potentially the most dramatic, immediate effects of it. But actually, the response was almost overwhelming from so many different quarters, and actually very little of it from the advertising sector, which is a curious thing to me. But I had people who read it and felt a personal reaction to it, people who recognized themselves in it, particularly people who experienced or live with ADHD. That was, hence why we did the ADHD episode. Yeah. But also people who work in government, people who work in civil society organizations, people who work in the healthcare sector, trade unions, employers, people who are just concerned about their children. It seemed to really strike a chord in a bunch of different ways. And I was really touched by that, but also kind of overwhelmed in some ways by the sense of urgency and action that people had from a lot of different directions. Just everyone feeling like it applied to something that was immediate in their lives, but hadn't necessarily been completely apparent to me until they talked about it.
I think what's interesting is how this does apply to absolutely everybody. Unless you are literally one of those refuseniks who refuses to have anything to do with an iPhone or any sort of smartphone. I mean, it does apply to everybody, and so everybody's got a stake in it.
Yeah, I think you don't even need to have a smartphone for this, for you to be feeling the effects of it, partially because everyone else does. So, there's that. But also my reflection was that we talk about attention as a metric, or attention as something that's tracked. And, and I talked about that in the paper, that we see it as something that's tracked, traded, harvested, something you grab. But actually, when I reflected on it, we're trying to apply a word to a human instinct. And so in that sense, attention is like a gift. And we think about the language we use around it every day. I'm giving you my attention. You have my attention. Can we have your attention? Attention being taken, or, focus being stolen, all of that. It's this really precious thing that humans have. It's our greatest gift. And I think the response that I had to it that seemed to resonate with people was the sense that this thing they value so much and they use to show love and care, or, hope and desire and everything else, was somehow out of their control. And that's all they want back.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people also, I got the sense, certainly when I read it, it hadn't quite been something I'd really considered. Oh, this is what's happening. And I think it was quite a revelatory moment for lots of people reading that piece, which again, we will link to if you haven't read it and you're just coming to the podcast for the first time. We will link to the piece all about attention scarcity in the show notes. But I think a lot of people read it and went, oh yeah, that's what's happening. Because this is still a very new field, it feels to me, a very new area we are discovering.
Yeah. And I think it's drawing together a bunch of different fields, right? So it's pulling together, advances in our understanding of behavioral science and neuroscience, right? So what we understand so much more about how we use and allocate energy in our body and how that affects the way we think and feel and perceive the world, alongside things like the basic economics of advertising and the digital economy. And then things like trust, perception, all of those things. I think pulling those things together rather than trying to treat them as individual problems. I think for me anyway, that was the revelation. But being able to get the time to do that, I mean, part of it as well is it's something I've been noticing over quite a few years working in this mixture of strategic communications, working on behalf of governments, but then also working in the commercial sector as well on, with big global brands and how you reach people. And I just hadn't had the time to try to figure out what exactly was making my brain itch, like what was causing this internal alarm bell going off, until I had a pure 6 to 8 weeks stretch of time where I could just pull back from everything and go, actually, why do I feel so frustrated and angry and scared and sad and but also viciously determined that something needs to change.
Yeah.
Something really profound.
And it is, it's funny because we've spoken a lot, and in the last few weeks, we are going to do more in the next episode about misinformation, disinformation, and so on, because all of that ties in, and we're doing a kind of mini series of that. This is like a little jump in the middle just to kind of, remind you that we're here, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But this is an intensely human thing. This is an emotional thing, isn't it? And actually for people, this is about the very core of their being. So although we're talking about things like AI and disinformation and blah, 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 all of this comes back to the idea that we as humans are having our attention taken in some way, or we are struggling with it.
Yeah. And I feel when I saw the changes, the significant changes in how much media cost or how much harder it was to access audiences, how audiences were feeling about things when, people were feeling about things when they use media, how they were feeling about whether they could trust something or share something, all of that. One of the things that really struck me was that we've over quantified media and we've lost sight of the fact that these are we're humans. When we engage with media, when we engage with communications, we're humans engaging with that. And the humanity of that has been lost in some way, mostly because we're looking at purely hard numbers and forgetting there's people behind that. When you're looking particularly at the delivery of communications, and I think attention metrics have a lot to answer for here. I did write about them in the paper going, maybe this is a helpful thing. And then over the last year, I've come to realize they're just rebadged metrics we've always used. But two, they've gotten so granular and so tactical and so specific that it's lost sight of the humans who are experiencing it. If you're measuring attention down to the second and you're just looking at it from say brand A, say Cadbury's, right? And then you go to Tesco and right, you got a second here. You're not considering that you're talking to the same people. You've lost sight of that these are people. And all of you fighting for a single second and deluging people with information as hard as humanly possible so you can maximize your 1 second with that person is actually leading people to check out. And that's something we're going to talk about today as well, is what, since I published that paper a year ago, what are some of the changes that we've seen in people's behavior online? And what does that say about, the ad-funded internet?
So let's start then by talking about the changes that you've seen in the last year since you wrote that piece. And just let me ask you this. Would you change now anything you wrote in that piece as a result of what you've learned in the last year?
Yes, there are some things I would definitely change.
What kind of areas would you now go back to and go, well, maybe that's something different that we should have considered?
So the first is that, and this is part of, that process of trying to articulate what the whole problem is. It was very focused on identifying the problem and drawing together the different parts of it. I didn't really go into solutions. And in the last year, I think I've just been so intrigued by how, once you open that can of worms, you find out there's actually many more cans of worms underneath that.
Yeah. It's a wormery, everybody.
It's a wormery. So just trying to pick through, actually, what are the implications of this? So one is, I think, actually just the focus on the problem and then getting to the part actually, how do you solve this? I think actually, instead of even making any recommendations at that point, I probably would have just gone, we're going to park that there because this is actually opened a whole host of problems and here's further areas of exploration that are needed. Also because I've seen some other bits of work that some may be leaping off of it directly without saying, some may not. But I think, this is a topic on people's agenda. But one of the things that I've seen is that the rush to solutions, actually, a lot of the solutions that are being offered are kind of more of the same, because it's a very human tendency, right? This is what I do. This is what I know how to do right now. So how do I do more of the thing that I'm doing right now to solve a problem of this significance, right?
Before I left the BBC, and I think Rebecca Skippage talked about this on a previous episode, there was a whole drive towards solutions-based journalism.
Yeah.
Which I kind of always thought was a bit silly, because why do we pretend that we've got the solution? Or indeed, even if you're asking other people, yes, you can talk about what the solutions might be, but you can't it's so difficult, I think, sometimes to come to a solution when sometimes that there isn't a solution there, right? There's, life is shades of grey, it's not black and white. And actually what you were saying, I think, about taking the time to think about all the other things before you even think of solutions, something I'm just not used to. And it takes me time to even consider that as a concept, because I'm so solutions driven.
Oh, me too. And I've actually had moments of, I'd say it's almost guilt in the last year. I'm like, why haven't I gotten to credible solutions yet? Oh, because this problem is enormous, James.
Yeah.
This
it is huge. Yeah.
It's huge and changing faster than we can keep up. And that's the other thing, I think, is looking at the data that I had to hand at the time. And then also, at the time I was doing this, we were starting to get that surge into AI, and, and including me, I was starting to play around with AI tools. I was doing an AI course, it's like all these things affected it. I wrote about the potential impact of generative AI. And I remember that one section of it where it said, look, originally when I wrote that section, what I was trying to do was also pull in some national security parts of it. And I dialed it back a little bit, partially because part of the audience reading it I knew would be people who were really well versed in it. And I didn't want to claim to be an expert in the statecraft of disinformation. I do know enough to be dangerous, but not enough. But I'm by no means, I'm not
Are we still talking about the attention economy, Claire?
Yeah, a little bit, yeah. I mean, yes, because it's all connected. But, I'm not a professor of disinformation at King's College London, right? So, and I was aware that people like that would read this piece. So I wanted to make sure that I touched on the problem and what the potential implications were without trying to overemphasize or tie it too much to something very, very specific. But I think I could have probably been a bit more direct with that, with the fact that actually some of those actors did know, without us even having had to have advances in behavioral science, that overwhelming people leads them to switch off. And actually that's the end result, right? So while we're super focused on messages and narratives, we're actually doing their job. We're helping their strategy by combating narratives with narratives or messages with messages without thinking about what's the cumulative effect of that on people who are receiving that information. And also the piece on generative AI, actually, that's the one thing where I think this is a really big problem. I think I actually leaned too much on the side of caution about the effect that would have. And I'll talk about, what's come out in the last year. And, our interview with Sam Stockwell in a couple of weeks, we'll also touch on that a little bit. But, I was almost too cautious about the generative AI effect and what that would do to people and what that would do to their buy-in into information systems and communications and public trust. And I probably could have been a bit more bullshit about that.
Look, let's be honest. You're looking at this now from a position of having another 12 months growth of understanding what it is that you didn't know at the time. So you don't need to be critical about yourself. I mean, it's fascinating, but you must have had people come to you in the last 12 months go, well, have you thought about this? Have you thought about this as well, as a result of that and a result of this podcast?
Yes. So one of the big themes that's come out of that is I think there's a growing group of people who are doing this, and the consideration of the effect on business functioning. So not just looking at it from a media and communications point of view, but actually the overwhelming amount of information that's being generated in business and the way it's hampering the ability to make decisions. And by extension of that, also any large organization, including governments. I think when we talked to Andrew Cheetham a few months ago, one of my questions to him was really about, is this affecting the way that decisions are being made or the ability to make informed decisions? He didn't demur on it. And actually he answered the way that he needed to for that specific case, which was the start of the Iran war, which is that no matter what you had in place then, it was so abnormally done that the deluge of information actually, or wasn't the main overriding factor. But I do think there's, in side conversations, I've heard that that is a factor affecting things. Very, very, very difficult to sort through, increasingly difficult to sort through information in a timely way and understand the difference. And also whether it's been manipulated going into AI for trust purposes. So that's something that I hadn't considered at the time immediately, but was one of the very first things that people raised and going like, yes, this is happening to my company. The other thing is the impact in schools. So a number of parents raised the fact that their children, their schools are struggling to cope with having to both not just help children navigate social media information trust, but actually the effect that information has on their feelings and their ability to function. And some of the solutions, you can just see they're like, we don't know what to do. I think we've talked about before about one parent told me that their school was going to stop showing Newsround because the news was too distressing. And the fact that we're now at that stage where we're thinking about not actually just helping kids try to navigate the news, but actually trying to shield them from it entirely because we can't figure out how to present it to them in a way that serves them is shocking to me.
Now, during the course of the last year, I think, as you've kind of pointed out already, this is an area that has become very much more on the agenda of most people. We've seen, for example, including politicians, because we've seen things like, and I know you have your own thoughts on it, we have at least seen the social media ban, right, come in, firstly in Australia and now in the UK.
Yeah.
Whatever you think of those proposals, people are actually taking notice of this, and there is at least an idea now in, I would say, the upper echelons of government and so on, because I know you have these conversations with people, that the scarcity of attention is a problem.
Yeah, it really is. The scarcity of attention is a problem. And I think when you look at it from either the government point of view, but also from brands increasingly, all of them are increasingly aware of it. But it's going into, right, how do we fight harder to get attention? How do we reconstruct the way our messages work to get attention? How do we think about, is it okay that I only get a second and a half instead of 2? This is where we're getting. So it's gone from recognizing the problem immediately to how do I do more of the solutions I currently have? Media literacy. I do think it's really not funny because media literacy is really important, and I think it's definitely got a place. But I think we've talked about this before with Rebecca Skippage and with others, that the way that what media literacy programs demand or suggest to people how they handle it is actually giving them more work, not less. And the one thing we've discovered is that people want less work. So,
do you know, there have been a couple of things in our most recent podcast that have made me really think. And one of them was talking to Rebecca about media literacy and about the idea that we need to get to the point where people can be media literate, but they don't really have the time to do it, and it's up to organisations like the BBC to do it. And then the other thing that really made me think at the same time was Stephen Lacey with his comments about the fact that the people who get most taken in, if you like, for want of a better phrase, by some of this stuff are the people who are the most media literate.
Yeah.
The people who read the most sources.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, you've got, yes, we should all be more media literate, but those who read the most media sources are kind of on the fringes here. We talk about solutions. Sometimes there aren't any because everybody's going off on different angles, and we've stopped the homogenization of media that we used to have in the 70s, 80s, 90s, where everybody knew who Take That were. And now it's a mad free-for-all. And I don't get the feeling that anyone really knows what to do at this point. Do you think that's fair?
I think that's fair, but I think it's also because, and this is a very natural human tendency, right? You're bought into the solutions you have. Entire industries, the industry you've come from, media and particularly from the BBC, you've got a set of tools and things you do, and changing that at the scale of the BBC, I cannot imagine what that's going to take. From my background from advertising, the whole business, the whole industry is built around particular business models that are built on volume, entirely built on volume, any way you cut it, no matter what size of company you are, organization you are, what you're selling volume. You make your money through volume, and you make your money through the ad exchanges, particularly the media buying and selling side of advertising. And so the digital ad exchanges in particular, you don't want to let that go. Or it's very scary to let that go, because you then have to reimagine the entire industry, how it makes money. And the appetite for change in humans in general is very small. Scale that up to something the size of an industry. That's where you are. And I think that's why we haven't necessarily seen really innovative solutions that have gotten people around them yet, is because you have to get them to the point where the threat becomes existential. But I think we're there at the moment.
I wanted to talk a bit about the kind of data that you've been looking into around things like the trust that people have in online media, because I know you've been looking at some of those numbers.
Yeah. So I think there's a couple things we can touch on. So the first is, in preparation for this podcast and over the last month or so, I've been looking at big reports into UK and US media behaviours, primarily from Ofcom as the main source, but also things like Deloitte does digital reporting, Internet Matters, that kind of thing. So the first thing to say is that although time spent online is up across the board, there's been some really dramatic shifts from AI and where people are spending that time and how they're spending it. So the main one being the effect of AI on search.
Okay, so tell us a bit more about that. So what's happening? Are people using AI all the time for search? You don't get your traditional Google searches anymore.
So what Ofcom was tracking was what happens to people's behavior with search, primarily Google, once they start using AI. And what you can see, we'll post a link to somewhere where I'll host this graphic somewhere so you can just see what they found. But when someone starts using AI, their search queries drop off by 25% within 4 months. And so Google's search traffic in the UK is down. And that's before you take into account the fact that they're then serving AI generated results as well, which are fulfilling a lot of those queries. So that's then caused a decrease in the number of people then visiting websites for information. So then what you've seen is, although online time is up, where that time is going, it's going less to ad-funded information websites or ad-funded news websites. People are still spending time with news and a bit more time with news, but they're spending it on aggregators, or the other winner for this, which I thought was interesting, was the BBC. BBC, Sky, news aggregators like Apple News. They're spending less time on health information websites. So if you can remember, things like Medline, Healthline, but more time with health and well-being apps and services like Strava or Apple Health or Fitbit. So there's demand there, but it looks to me like that demand is being fulfilled by AI. And there was also a huge number of people who were using AI, or it's, changed their first point of call for news to AI. That's a big thing. That's a really big thing. And we can talk about, the value of the information coming back from AI or whether it's reliable or not. But just personally, I've noticed that Google put a lot more effort into making those AI search results better than they have done into making the quality of search better. Something that had been on, the decline in the quality of search results in general before AI came into mass being, was something that was already raising alarm bells for a lot of people as well, because it was introducing a lot of friction into search. So basically anything that's ad funded, and I think then by association introduces friction into the user journey, people are walking away from that and towards things that give them simple, good enough results. And then they're then switching their time to platforms that then either, help them, or a big winner in the last year has been streaming. So YouTube in particular, YouTube streaming in particular, they've put a lot of effort into basically becoming TV, and they're trying to position themselves as TV, but also other streaming services in general have benefited from that in the last year. X, or Twitter, is down massively. I think it was 13 percentage points, but I'll double check that figure. And that traffic didn't seem to go anywhere else. So it arguably went then to streaming, because streaming is the overall winner. Reddit's been another winner. It's not going to Meta unless it's going to WhatsApp. So messaging apps also benefited from this. It's going away from that, going to streaming. So the big takeaway for me from that is that people, as far as they can, are opting out of the ad-funded internet and into places that aren't ad-funded. And not because advertising is bad or they hate advertising, but actually because the incentives for websites and services that rely on advertising is to introduce friction that increases clicks, that increases the amount you have to scroll through something to find information, because all of that is built on trying to measure dwell time.
So from my perspective, I think, to put this in the way that my brain works, what you're basically saying is people are choosing to use AI because it's easy and it's quick and it gives them a good enough answer, which makes perfect sense because people don't have time, do they?
That's exactly right. And so the way that the digital economy, the attention economy has been built has been to try to, like, the incentives are all screwed up, right? So it's tried to maximize the amount of time that people spend on something. We've used it as like a game to keep people, but actually they're opting out. And I think one of the other things that came out of the reading was that even though online time is up and people are distributing in other ways, complementing that is that huge amounts of distrust and dissatisfaction with online life. So the first is there was a Deloitte digital report that said almost a third of Gen Z UK users have deleted a social media app in the last 12 months. And their reasons for deleting it are that they think it's sapping their brain, it's making them tired, they don't like the misinformation, and they're done. They're done. No, it's not to say that they're completely opted out of social media, because clearly that's not the case, but it was 29% have claimed that they've deleted a social media app in the last 12 months. It says quite a lot of the age group that most uses it, spends the most time with it. And also that if you are a tech platform, you use those numbers to justify your value to the stock exchange. So that's a bad sign. If I were a social media platform, I'd be a little bit concerned. If I'm an advertiser, I'm also concerned.
And it's not just even in people's personal lives, is it? Because, there was a Microsoft study I know you looked at around people's working lives.
Oh, yeah.
Talking about the kind of disruption that every day people have to cope with because of their digital lives.
Yeah, this Microsoft study was fascinating. 117 emails per day is what the average worker receives, and 153 Teams messages. And they are, on average, interrupted every 2 minutes. Every 2 minutes.
I mean, it's crazy.
I wrote about, in the paper I set out, what happens when you're having to deal with an interruption, like how much energy your body tries to devote to dealing with things. And it's an energy sap. I mean, it's absolutely no wonder to me that people are opting out of as much as they can in their personal life out of the things that are extracting their attention, because they're spending all day at work having their attention extracted. And that's before we get into the effect of generative AI on the working life, right? Anecdotally, and, I've seen some studies where it says workers are complaining that they're being inundated with AI-generated information. So yes, it's helping you technically, quote unquote, do things faster, but you're just passing the burden of that onto your colleagues when you're over-generating information and giving it to them and then being copied en masse onto something. People are done. They're done.
Absolutely, they are done. And this little section is all about the fact that this is now an issue that is very much on the agenda. As I said, we have seen the social media ban, announced by government, whether or not you think it's the right thing or not. Do you get a sense from the people that you talk to that government of all hues across the world is taking this whole issue seriously enough at the moment?
I think in Europe, it's being taken seriously. I think in other parts of the world, in the US, I don't think it's at a government level. It's obviously not being taken seriously, and we can understand the reasons for that. But on a personal level, absolutely. People are, they're desperate. They're desperate for change. I've got another stat as well that I thought was really important. People are asked every year by Ofcom, do the benefits outweigh the risks of being online? In 2023, 71% said the benefits outweighed the risks. In 2024, 72% said the benefits outweighed the risks. In 2025, what do you think that number was?
I don't know. Go on.
59%.
Wow. Okay.
So it's pretty stable for a long time. And then in 1 year, a 13 percentage point decline. and whether the benefits outweigh the risks. That ambivalence now about whether even online, just online in general, is good for you or not is huge. And that's an all adult thing. So, if we think about our conversation with Stephen Lacey in particular and Rebecca Skippage, and, there's others I've spoken to, one of their observations about the demands from government or people's concerns about the way Britain is going in particular is the focal point of children. We think about, is life going to be better for my children? It's about protecting children. The fact that the social media ban is about protecting children has not escaped my notice. It's not to say that that's not important. I think it is important, but I think it's how we're expressing our dissatisfaction with our experience of this information environment, of this media environment, and how bought in organizations are. Like, this is people begging for it to stop. And I don't think it'll work. But I also am like, you know what? Actually, if this gets us to have a serious conversation about regulating social media, regulating the online environment, regulating the advertising environment, right? Regulating access to that, then 100%, let's do it. Let's do it. And also, let's talk seriously then as well about what does it mean to be a responsible advertiser? It's not just about where's your advertising showing up, but actually is it about how you advertise altogether, right? Like, how do we, as a brand, as an advertiser, what's your covenant with the public? How do you think about and respect attention? How do you take that into consideration in your planning? Because it can no longer be about reaching people. And if you continue to do that, it's going to burn down. Because I think all that opting out of the ad-funded internet, that's actually about now the sustainability of the advertising ecosystem and the communications ecosystem as a whole. That is that ecosystem at the point of collapse. And if that happens, you'd have to reimagine how your business grows entirely. You'd have to reimagine your revenue streams and your services, your sources of growth.
So let's talk about solutions then.
Yeah.
Is part of the issue here, when it comes to thinking about solutions, the fact that we are right on the jagged edge of a new dawn?
Mm-hmm.
AI is changing society. I think everyone kind of agrees with that to a certain extent. AI is changing society. It is potentially changing work. It is potentially changing our lives, our personal lives as well. So it's part of the issue here that we simply don't understand yet what is happening and what the ramifications of that change is.
I think we understand what's happening. I think we don't want to confront the ramifications, but I think it starts with being more aware of attention. So it starts with becoming attention aware. So understanding not just how people access media, but how they experience it, and then what frame of mind they're in when they receive messages or receive information or interact with it. I think it sounds woolly, but I think it's actually really, really practical. I've developed a system for it, actually. I'm looking for pilots because I really want to, I want to test this, right? Like, I think we need to do something. So if anyone out there wants to go through this process to test it and see how useful it is, please do get in touch. There's one I'm working on at the moment. I think in the next 6 months, I could probably do 4 more. And I would really like to do that because I think that this is one remedy to this problem, is instead of going straight to crafting messages and figuring out how to get it in front of people, it's actually stepping back and going, right, let's factor in people's attention, their actual capacity. Let's build in a picture of people's attention capacity into our media plans, into our communications plans, into planning television shows. The fact that I've gone to television shows is telling, right? Whatever it is you have at your disposal, right? Like whether you're planning a launch for something or how your brand communicates with people in general, how it builds desirability over time. Or if you're the government, how do you prepare people for a crisis, or are your crisis management plans up to scratch? I think this is like, there's a case for all of this.
During the course of the podcast, we've done a lot of different topics, one of which was actually talking to some very eminent academics in the US about Attensity, which was their digital detox movement. And I think you and I were both relatively skeptical.
Oh, very skeptical.
I can't help it. That's just my nature, but still. Yeah. But actually, there is a space for that, isn't there? The kind of digital detox thing. And you've seen that in the last year, what was it, 13% of people saying, they're no longer using social media?
100%. I think you and I I think rightly, I think for good reasons, were challenging them quite a lot on like, what is it that you want to achieve? Like, what is your vision for this world? Because it felt very woolly. And I think even then they weren't even really advocating for detox. I couldn't really fully understand at the time what they're advocating for. But I think as I've thought about it, their point about needing to study attention, the way they kept calling it, study it, study it, study it, is right. They're right. They're completely right. And they have a coalition of people who are interested in it, including us, right? Like, this is something that we're eminently interested in and think is really important. I think it's taking that next stage of going, right, okay, now that we have, consolidating that information about attention, how do we incorporate that into the things we need to do? Whether it's, reaching the public, building trust in both the government and just general trust in society, or whether it's actually like, say you're selling shoes. Like, how do you? And I mean that really seriously, because I think that advertising and commerce and brands, they play a really important part of our society. And also, they are the biggest stakeholders and the most influential and most important stakeholders in this. The ability to change rests with them. And if customers matter to you, we got to take this on board.
And you talked about government as well. And I know one thing you want to see is the revival of the Central Office of Information.
That's right.
Can you explain why you think that's important?
Yeah. So until early 2011, most government communications went through something called the Central Office of Information, or the COI. And the COI acted as both like a mega client. I mean, if you were working in the advertising industry, you regarded them as a mega client. They were one of the biggest advertisers in the UK. But they were one of the biggest advertisers in the UK because everything from NHS communications or health communications to army recruitment to anything from the Department of Energy, HMRC, all of that went through the COI. And the COI did the communications planning as well for government. And so it acted as a body that not just did procurement, but also best practice, consolidated information on what the public expected from government, what issues needed to be communicated to them, how it was best done, and balancing all the competing needs of government and its services in a way that was responsive to public needs. It was disbanded because, if I remember right, the thinking at the time was that the government actually didn't need to communicate that much. Like, it was a ridiculous waste of money, James, to communicate to the public. Then they rapidly realized, actually, you do, because the public are voters. And so they're stakeholders in government and society, and fine. But the COI was never revived, and communications devolved to the departments. But in doing so, that voice of the public, that public interest, what matters to the public, became very fragmented. And I think communications from the government has suffered as a result. And I also think that that's contributed to the decline in trust. The other thing that didn't exist when the COI existed last was Facebook and Meta. And actually spend on Google, right? So they weren't the stakeholders. So a lot of the money that COI spent went to British media outfits, which was spent on British production, British media owners, reaching the British public. So
it's the circular economy.
The circular economy of media, right? So there weren't ever questions about, one, the economic impact of the contribution to the British economy of the communications that you were putting out. And the second, the national security implications of it, right? Because it was never going to a platform that was trying to say, I don't know, undermine British law, or bring in things like the Online Safety Act or the Digital Services Act or GDPR into the scope of trade negotiations, for example, or anything like that, right? It's like none of that existed. And I think today now, because the landscape has changed so much, I think we're also losing sight of the fact that communications, the way you spend money on it as a government, contributes to national security and contributes to national safety, and who you're spending that with matters too. So I think the Central Office of Information is a really important role that needs to be brought back. One, to make sure that the public's voice is heard and that there's a better, more consolidated understanding of what the public expects from government and how government needs to communicate and where those gaps are in order to best achieve that. I think, having a place where there's central lessons and experts in this matters, but I think it also matters to the sustainability of media, creative, and communications ecosystems and economy, but also our national security.
But just from a point of view of your average voter, I mean, would the idea be then that the COI would just deliver a more coherent government set of communications? Is that why you think it should come back more than anything else? Because from there, they might be thinking, well, I still see posters for my local GP surgery. I mean, what is it that I'm actually getting from these government comms?
It's hard for us to remember how well that actually worked because it worked really well. It was much more effective. So all the questions that people have, I think a lot of questions that people have about what does government do for me? You know, how does it do it? How do I access this? Will be better answered because the communications will be planned better. Much better value for money when it's consolidated into one place, not just because you're not duplicating jobs, but also because there's a stakeholder there saying, okay, it's January, HMRC, you're on, May, military recruitment, or, you know, whatever it is that you're doing. It's sequencing it, and they're not in competition with each other. So it's better value for money. You'll hear from government better and more effectively than you would have done in the past. And the government will hear from you because there will be a body that's responsible for taking your points of view on board, understanding what you need or want from government, and making sure that that is communicated back to the government in a way that's important.
Finally, let's just talk a bit about you, if we don't mind, and about your next 12 months, you know, which includes this podcast, of course. What is it that you are going to try to achieve or look at with attention, do you think, in the next 12 months?
Again, pilot program, terrific. I really want to understand and get a better sense of how to make sure that these lessons go back to the people that need them and make them really effective so that our communications is better, more effective, and the UK's economy is better, more sustainable as a result. 2, working and finding like-minded individuals, partners, people who are really actually starting to make these changes in their everyday lives or the work that they're doing, campaigning for issues that are related to this. So we have, in a couple of weeks, we'll be talking to Alex Tate from Reform Political Advertising, who we mentioned on the last episode, about making sure election advertising is fact-based, that there's standards they have to adhere to, which, again, sounds obvious, but wasn't, and was a really, really big effort to get onto the legislative agenda. Like, it's the fact that something that seems so simply true, and why wouldn't this be a law, that it took so long to get made, I think is really good for us to understand. Like, what does that kind of change take? How do you have to do it? And what are the blockers to doing it? And others who are working, whether it's, you know, working with teenagers or working with other parts of society, understanding how they're reacting to these changes and what does it mean for the way that we need to think about, you know, workforce or actually communications, the media environment in general. The third is working with organizations, including in media itself, to think about what do the public now expect from media organizations, and how do you, as businesses or as government, as entities, prepare yourself to meet those needs? Because people are way ahead of us on this, right? Like, you know, as we talked about today with all those, you know, all the stats, all that information about how people's behaviors have changed, they're already way ahead of us. They're already opting out. So instead of trying to demand or scream at them to get back in, how do we meet that demand now? How do we do that?
Claire, it's always a pleasure. If you want to get in contact, hello@canwehaveyyourattention.com. Especially if you want to talk about any of those pilot projects that you want to do, that would be great. In the future, we are going to have episodes on things like science communication.
Yes.
I'm looking forward to.
That's so
going to be
exciting.
Great. Absolutely. And as you said, political advertising as well. We'll talk about all of those things. And if there's anything else you want to get in contact with us about and other suggestions for topics all about attention, we'd love to hear from you. Until then, Claire, thank you very much.
Thank you, James.